Hey guys, so I want to talk about Hocus Pocus 2. Personally, I enjoyed the film. Now, mind you, I don't mind Hocus Pocus, but it's not like something I feel I have to watch. I'd say every year. If I think about it, then I'll watch it for sure. I think it's a fine film. Like it's a fun film. Um, and this one was definitely a fun film. There's definitely though some differences, and so I want to compare the two. I want to compare Hocus Pocus and Hocus Pocus 2. So, with Hocus Pocus, it definitely was it definitely is a cult classic. When that film came out, it wasn't as popular as it is today. And we see, it opens up, uh, we get like a flashback of the Sanderson sisters, Thackeray. I always thought it was Zachary. And Emily, and how Thackeray is going to save Emily. And sadly, that fails. Um, and essentially, then it turns into almost seems like a retelling of this story to the class in Salem, where we have Max, Danny, and Allison. Now, I'm not going to go over the whole plot line of the story. I'll talk about some few, I'd say, major scenes that I think are, I'd say, key to point out when talking about both films. Um, but you can definitely tell, at least for me, there's, I'd say, a different tone to both films. The first film definitely made you feel, I'd say, like more action packed, a little bit more like spooky or scary in a way, while Hocus Pocus 2 was, I feel, a lot more family friendly. I feel it really wasn't as, like, I wouldn't say action packed. Like, there's still things going on, but I feel like it wasn't as, like, spooky or. God, I can't find the right word, but essentially, with everything that goes on in the first film, their, like, goal is to essentially, like, get the souls of these kids. While in the second film, at first it seems like it's going to be that, but then they're like, let's perform this other spell that, this witch told us not to perform. And so they end up going that route, and they want to then get the descendant of the reverend who, they knew when they were kids, who they hated. And so it just has like a whole different like vibe to it with how these events are played out. We also have to keep in mind too, the actresses are older in this film. I feel like they are still trying to project the same amount of energy. However, this like there's like 30 years in between both of these films. 29 if you want to be exact. And the eldest, Bette Midler, is about 70 in her 70s. And so, yeah, when you're older, you only have, I would say, so much energy to give and so much you can do. And I know there's definitely things with Hocus Pocus 2 you can nitpick on, especially if you want to compare the, I'd say, performance scenes where you have in Hocus Pocus, Winifred and the Sanderson sisters performing I Put a Spell on You, while in Hocus Pocus 2, it's now one way or another. And in Hocus Pocus, you can see, okay, they were just performing that song. So she was hearing the words, and then, put her own words to it and, added the spell. While in one way or another, when did she hear that song? And so I get where there's like criticism with that. I'm gonna assume she heard it somewhere. Somewhere around she heard it. I have no clue where, and we just didn't see it. That's just my thought process, and that's what I'm hoping and wishing for. But I would say the main critique or criticism with Hocus Pocus 2 is most likely the ending. Now, whether you like the film, whether you like the film, whether you don't like the film, the endings are very different. Now, in Hocus Pocus, you had, in a way you're like rooting for the kids. You don't want the witches to win. And then they just kind of like die, While in this one, like in Hocus Pocus 2, we get, I'd say, this new, you can almost say trope that a lot of people don't like. And I get that, where they perform this spell, and with that, there's a warning to the spell. You lose what you love most. And Winifred, is now all powerful, wants to take over Salem, but she loses her sisters. Like, her sisters, poof, go by. And Winifred then is very much in a, I feel, vulnerable state, because she's like, I can't do this without my sisters. Like, I need my sisters. And I think that's something that this film, I feel, touches on just like a tad more, especially with the opening. It really showcases like how much her sisters mean to her. While in the first film, I feel like we didn't get a lot of that. And I have a little theory, and I'll share that later as to maybe why that is. And I don't know if my theory is right. That's why it's a theory. But Winifred then kind of asks, like, what can we do to bring them back? Like, what can I do? They can't bring them back, but she can go with them and essentially, like, die. It sounds like. I don't know if they're dead or if they just, like, poof, went away. I don't. Sounds like they died. But, magic is a fickle thing. So, she ends up dying and is like, oh, thank you. Like, now I can be with my sisters. And that's where people, I think, that's where, like, I feel one of the main criticisms is, like, kind of the character of Winifred. Now, my theory as to maybe why. Because I thought about this a lot. Because I've watched this film now 3 times. One, because I did cry at the end. Like, the first time I watched it, I got a little misty. I didn't actually, like, full on cry, but got misty. Now, if we think about it, in the first film, we get the perspective of almost like a flashback. We see this evil thing that the sisters are doing. It's from the perspective of, like, other people around the area who don't like witches and how, like, evil these witches are. But then it cuts to a story to where we get, again, people around the witches, more so from, like, I would say Max, Danny, Allison's perspective, or, like, people in the town. Now, we still see the Sanderson sisters throughout this film, and, like, the kids aren't around. That's why I think it's more so, like, the perception of, like, everyone else around them. And that's why we get, like, oh, they're evil or everything else, as well as just from their actions. But I really think just the opening scene kind of gives us that implication ourselves. And these viewpoints that we're seeing throughout the film. Like, who are we focusing more on when we see this film? Now, in Hocus Pocus 2, we get instead an opening scene flashing back into the Sandersons when they were like kids, when they were younger. And Winifred is just 16. And so I don't know then if that's like the perspective of this is not necessarily their film, but like the Sandersons. And so we're focusing more on the Sandersons instead of the people around the town. But again, when we keep going throughout the film, we're seeing like these other kids, like Becca, Cassie, and I think it's Izzy. I honestly forgot some of the names, so I'm hoping those are right. But again, even though we're like seeing these other characters, it almost feels like we're not focusing on them enough, and we're still focusing on the Sanderson sisters. We spend a lot of time with the Sanderson sisters. So I really feel like it has a lot to do with like the perception that we're given and the information and how the story starts with the films. Because we get in the second film where we see, you know, Winifred loves her sisters, she needs her sisters, all that, like all that good stuff. Well, in the first film, we kind of got that, but there was a lot more like, I would say bickering, poking fun at, belittling. There wasn't as much like love there. And we still get that throughout this film in Hocus Pocus too, like don't get me wrong. But we definitely see a new perspective in regards to how Winifred cherishes, I think, her sisters. So I wasn't too upset by the ending because I'm like, we kind of see this now. But I also see where it's like, all right, but if we're looking at like from the first, like throughout her whole character, it does seem like a little off. But I don't know if that's because of the perception that we're given. That's just my theory. I also feel like Hocus Pocus 2 does a good job of welcoming new people who maybe haven't seen Hocus Pocus, and you know, people who think maybe the first one's fine. Because again, it is a cult classic. A lot of people hold it dearly to their hearts. And I think this film does a fine job of like summing up what happened in the first film while, you know, continuing on with the story. And with that post-credit scene, it really does, in Hocus Pocus 2, it really does open up to the fact of, hey, we could have a Hocus Pocus 3. But I think if they wanted to have a Hocus Pocus 3 with the Sanderson sisters, Teddy's here, I'm sorry. I think if we wanted to have a Hocus Pocus 3, and if the Sanderson sisters are involved, I don't know if they would be. They would need to do it quickly. That's all I would have to say. And that's kind of my thoughts on it. Just kind of comparing the two. I know there's just been a lot of conversation with it. I think they're both fine films. I definitely see where one is more like action-packed, while the other is more, I feel, family-friendly in a sense. So that's kind of my take on it. Feel free to leave your thoughts down below on what you thought of these films, what you think of these films, and I will talk to you all later. Bye.